At exactly 8:55 p.m. on a Tuesday evening in October 2008, 73-year-old Florence Whitman stepped out of her modest two-story home on Maple Street, carrying a burgundy leather suitcase that hadn't seen daylight in over a decade. The porch light cast long shadows across her weathered face as she paused at the front door, her arthritic fingers trembling slightly as she turned the key one final time. So, Henderson from across the street would later tell police she noticed Florence standing there for what seemed like an eternity, just staring at that brass doorknob as if she were memorizing it. The autumn wind rustled through the oak trees, sending a cascade of golden leaves across the sidewalk where Florence's sensible black shoes would leave their last prints. The temperature had dropped to 42 degrees that evening, and Mrs. Henderson remembered thinking it was too cold for an elderly woman to be out walking, especially with luggage. She wore her navy blue coat, the one with the missing button she'd been meaning to replace for months, and carried a small purse clutched tightly against her chest. Her silver hair, usually perfectly set from her weekly appointment at Dolores's beauty salon, looked disheveled, as if she'd been running her hands through it all day. The streetlights illuminated the deep lines around her eyes, lines that seemed more pronounced than usual, etched with an exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue. What Mrs. Henderson couldn't have known was that Florence had spent the previous 3 hours sitting at her kitchen table, writing and rewriting the same letter, her handwriting growing more erratic with each attempt. The kitchen clock had ticked away the minutes with mechanical precision, while Florence struggled with words that felt inadequate for the weight of what she needed to say. She'd gone through 7 sheets of her good stationery, the cream-colored paper with the embossed roses that her daughter had given her last Christmas. The final version lay sealed in an envelope, hidden in a place where she knew it would eventually be found, but not too soon. She'd chosen the location carefully, somewhere that would remain undisturbed for years, but would inevitably be discovered when the time was right. The letter contained truths that had festered in her heart for decades, secrets that had shaped every decision she'd made since 1963, and an explanation for what she was about to do. As Florence walked down the front path, her suitcase bumping against her leg with each step, she moved with the deliberate pace of someone who had made peace with an irreversible decision. The suitcase, though not large, seemed to weigh her down more than it should have. Inside were carefully selected items: 3 changes of clothes, her mother's pearl necklace, a photograph of her late husband Robert, and a manila envelope containing documents that would have shocked anyone who knew her. At the corner of Maple and 3rd Street, Florence stopped under the streetlight and looked back at her house one final time. The windows glowed warmly, and she could see the silhouette of her favorite chair in the living room. Mrs. Henderson, still watching from her window, noticed that Florence seemed to be talking to herself, her lips moving silently as if she were rehearsing something important. As Florence disappeared into the darkness beyond the streetlight's reach, her footsteps echoing off the empty pavement, she carried with her the weight of 45 years of carefully guarded secrets. Florence Whitman had lived on Maple Street for 47 years, moving there as a young bride in 1961, with her husband Robert, a quiet man who worked at the local steel mill. She was the kind of woman who knew everyone's business but kept her own counsel, who brought casseroles to new neighbors and never missed a church service at St. Mary's Episcopal. Her house, with its white picket fence and meticulously maintained garden, had become a cornerstone of the neighborhood's identity. After Robert's death from lung cancer in 1995, Florence had settled into a routine as predictable as sunrise. Every morning at 7 a.m., she'd shuffle to the front porch in her pink terry cloth robe to collect the newspaper. By 8 a.m., she'd be dressed and ready for her daily walk to Miller's Corner Store, where she'd buy fresh bread and exchange pleasantries with whoever happened to be working the register. Tuesdays were for grocery shopping at the Piggly Wiggly, Wednesdays for her hair appointment, and Fridays for volunteering at the church food bank. But beneath this veneer of suburban normalcy, Florence carried a burden that had grown heavier with each passing year. Those who knew her well, and there were precious few, might have noticed the way her hands shook when she thought no one was looking, or how she sometimes stared out her kitchen window for hours, watching the street with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to the mundane activities of neighborhood life. Her daughter Margaret lived 3 states away in Colorado and called every Sunday at exactly 2 p.m. These conversations followed a script as rigid as Florence's daily routine. Discussions about the weather, Margaret's job at the insurance company, and updates about Florence's granddaughter, Emma, who was studying journalism at the University of Denver. Florence always asked about Emma with particular interest, though she'd only met the girl a handful of times during brief holiday visits. What Margaret didn't know was that Florence kept a detailed journal about Emma's life, clipping newspaper articles about her academic achievements and carefully preserving every photograph Margaret sent. In her bedroom dresser, hidden beneath layers of carefully folded sweaters, was a manila folder labeled Emma that contained more information about her granddaughter than Margaret realized Florence possessed. The neighbors saw Florence as a harmless elderly widow, perhaps a bit eccentric but fundamentally benign. She was the woman who remembered everyone's birthday, who left anonymous gifts on doorsteps during hard times, and who somehow always knew when someone needed help before they asked for it. Children in the neighborhood called her Grandma Flo, and she always had peppermint candies in her purse for them. But there were moments when the mask slipped. Mrs. Patterson from next door had once seen Florence standing in her backyard at midnight, digging in the garden with a flashlight. When asked about it the next day, Florence had claimed she was planting bulbs, though Mrs. Patterson couldn't recall seeing any new flowers bloom that spring. There were the phone calls that came at odd hours. Florence would answer with a sharp, "Hello?" and then speak in hushed tones, often ending the conversation abruptly when she noticed someone nearby. Most telling were the letters. Every few months, Florence would receive mail with no return address, always in the same handwriting. She would collect these letters personally from the mailbox, never allowing them to sit with the rest of her mail. Mrs. Henderson had noticed this pattern over the years, watching Florence's face drain of color whenever one of these mysterious envelopes appeared. The last such letter had arrived 3 days before Florence's disappearance. Mrs. Henderson remembered seeing Florence retrieve it from the mailbox, her hands visibly shaking as she tore it open right there on the sidewalk. Whatever the letter contained had caused Florence to stumble backward, gripping the mailbox for support. She'd stood there for several minutes reading and rereading the contents before hurrying inside, the letter clutched against her chest. October 14th, 2008, began like any other Tuesday in Florence Whitman's carefully orchestrated life. But those who knew her best would later recall subtle signs that something was different. She'd skipped her morning walk to Miller's corner store, the first time in over 3 years, and when Mrs. Patterson waved from her garden, Florence had responded with a distracted nod rather than her usual cheerful greeting. At 9:30 a.m., Florence made an unexpected trip to First National Bank, where she'd maintained accounts for over 4 decades. Teller Susan Morrison later told investigators that Florence had seemed agitated, requesting to access her safety deposit box and making a substantial cash withdrawal, $8,000 in various denominations. When Susan asked if everything was all right, Florence had simply smiled and said she was taking care of some old business. The safety deposit box visit was particularly unusual. Florence had accessed it only twice in the previous 10 years, both times to add documents rather than remove them. But on this day, she spent nearly 20 minutes inside the private viewing room, emerging with a manila envelope tucked securely in her purse. Bank security footage would later show her pausing at the exit, looking back toward the vault area with an expression that Susan Morrison described as profound sadness. From the bank, Florence drove to Riverside Cemetery, where Robert had been buried 13 years earlier. The groundskeeper, Miguel Santos, noticed her car in the parking lot around 11 a.m. and observed her sitting by Robert's grave for over an hour. She wasn't crying or praying, Miguel later recalled, just sitting perfectly still, occasionally speaking in a voice too low to hear. When she finally stood to leave, she placed a single white rose on the headstone. Unusual because Florence typically brought elaborate bouquets during her monthly visits. Her next stop was even more puzzling. At 1:15 p.m., Florence appeared at the offices of Hartwell & Associates, a law firm she'd never used before. She requested an immediate appointment with any available attorney, claiming it was urgent. Junior partner David Hartwell agreed to see her, and their meeting lasted exactly 45 minutes. Hartwell would later describe Florence as extremely nervous but determined, and confirmed that she'd made significant changes to her will, and left specific instructions regarding her estate. Most mysteriously, Florence had brought with her a sealed envelope marked to be opened only in the event of my death or disappearance, which she insisted be placed in the firm's secure files. She paid the consultation fee in cash and made Hartwell promise that the envelope would remain unopened unless the specified conditions were met. When he asked if she was in some kind of danger, Florence had simply replied, "We're all in danger from our past, Mr. Hartwell. Some of us just know it." The afternoon brought more unusual behavior. Florence visited 3 different stores: a hardware store where she purchased a small shovel, a stationery shop where she bought expensive writing paper, and a travel agency where she inquired about bus schedules to various cities. The travel agent, Linda Chen, remembered Florence asking specifically about routes that didn't require identification and destinations where someone could start fresh without questions. At 4 p.m., Florence returned home and began what neighbors would later describe as a frenzy of activity. Through her kitchen window, Mrs. Patterson observed Florence moving boxes from the basement to the backyard, where she appeared to be burning papers in an old metal trash can. The smoke was thick and black, suggesting she was destroying more than just household documents. When Mrs. Patterson approached the fence to ask if everything was all right, Florence had waved her away, saying she was just doing some overdue spring cleaning. The burning continued for nearly 2 hours. Mrs. Henderson, watching from her living room window, counted at least 6 trips Florence made from the house to the fire, each time carrying armloads of papers, photographs, and what appeared to be clothing. The flames were so intense that Mr. Rodriguez from 2 houses down had considered calling the fire department, but the burning stopped just before he reached for the phone. As evening approached, Florence's behavior became even more erratic. She made 3 phone calls from her landline, each conversation brief and conducted in hushed tones. The last call, placed at 7:30 p.m., lasted only 30 seconds, but Mrs. Henderson could hear Florence's voice through the thin walls, saying something that sounded like, "It's time," before hanging up abruptly. At 8 p.m., Florence began packing her suitcase. The bedroom light remained on, and through the sheer curtains, neighbors could see her moving back and forth, carefully selecting items. She spent considerable time at her dresser, apparently going through drawers methodically. At one point, she sat on the bed for nearly 10 minutes, holding what appeared to be a photograph, before placing it carefully in the suitcase. The final hour before her departure was spent in the kitchen, where Florence wrote her last letter. Mrs. Patterson could see her through the window, hunched over the table, writing with intense concentration. She would write for a few minutes, then stop, stare at the paper, and begin again. This process repeated several times until at 8:45 p.m., she sealed the final version in an envelope and disappeared from view. 10 minutes later, Florence Whitman emerged from her house for the last time, carrying the burgundy suitcase and wearing the navy coat that would become the last image anyone would have of her. As she walked away from the life she'd built on Maple Street, she left behind more questions than answers, and a mystery that would consume her family for the next 15 years. Margaret Whitman's frantic phone call to the Millbrook Police Department came at 6:47 a.m. on Thursday, October 16, 2008, exactly 36 hours after her mother had last been seen. Margaret had driven through the night from Colorado after Florence failed to answer her regular Sunday phone call, a ritual that had never been broken in the 13 years since Robert's death. "Something's wrong," Margaret told Sergeant Patricia Reeves, her voice cracking with exhaustion and fear. "My mother would never just leave. She's lived in that house for 47 years. She doesn't go anywhere without telling someone." Margaret had arrived at the Maple Street house at 5 a.m., using the spare key hidden under the ceramic frog by the front steps, a hiding place that had remained unchanged since Margaret's childhood. The house told a story of deliberate preparation rather than sudden departure. Florence's bed was neatly made, her dishes washed and put away, and her medications organized in their weekly pill dispenser. But there were troubling signs that suggested this wasn't a typical trip. Her purse was gone, but her reading glasses remained on the kitchen table beside an unfinished crossword puzzle. Her winter coat hung in the closet, despite the October chill, and her car keys sat in their usual spot by the front door. Most disturbing was what Margaret found in the basement. The storage area, typically organized with military precision, looked as though it had been ransacked. Boxes were overturned, their contents scattered across the concrete floor. Photo albums lay open, many with pictures torn out, leaving only the corner fragments held by mounting tape. A filing cabinet that had always been locked now stood open and empty, its contents apparently among the papers Florence had burned in the backyard. Sergeant Reeves arrived at 8:15 a.m. with Officer James Mitchell, and their initial assessment confirmed Margaret's fears. The house showed clear signs of someone preparing for a permanent departure, but the manner of preparation suggested urgency rather than planning. In Florence's bedroom, they found her jewelry box open and partially emptied, with only the most valuable pieces missing. Her suitcase was gone, along with several changes of clothes, but her winter wardrobe remained untouched. The kitchen yielded the most significant clue. On the table, partially hidden beneath the unfinished crossword, was a sheet of Florence's good stationery with several false starts of what appeared to be a letter. The visible fragments included phrases like, "I can't live with this anymore," and "the truth about what happened in 1963. But the complete sentences had been scratched out so heavily that they were illegible. Mrs. Henderson's testimony provided the timeline for Florence's departure, but it raised more questions than it answered. "She was carrying that old suitcase like it weighed a ton," Mrs. Henderson told the officers, "and she kept looking back at the house like she was memorizing it. I've never seen her look so defeated." When asked if Florence had seemed afraid, Mrs. Henderson paused thoughtfully. Not afraid exactly, more like resigned, like someone who'd finally made a decision they'd been putting off for years. The investigation expanded quickly. Officer Mitchell canvassed the neighborhood while Sergeant Reeves contacted local hospitals, bus stations, and taxi companies. The responses were uniformly negative. No one matching Florence's description had been seen at any transportation hub, and no medical facilities had admitted anyone by her name. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. Margaret provided investigators with Florence's recent medical records, financial information, and a list of her few close friends. The medical records showed no signs of dementia or mental illness that might explain sudden erratic behavior. Financially, Florence was stable but not wealthy. Her savings account contained $23,000, and her monthly Social Security and pension payments covered her modest expenses comfortably. The friend interviews proved equally puzzling. Florence's closest companion, Dolores Martinez from the beauty salon, hadn't noticed anything unusual during Florence's last appointment on Wednesday, October 8th. She seemed a little quiet, Dolores recalled, but Flo was always a private person. She got her usual wash and set, paid in cash like always, and scheduled her next appointment for the following week. Nothing seemed wrong. Church friends at St. Mary's Episcopal reported similar observations. Florence had attended Sunday service on October 12th, sitting in her usual pew and participating in the hymns with her customary enthusiasm. Reverend Thomas Walsh remembered her staying after service to help arrange flowers for the altar, a task she'd performed monthly for over 20 years. She seemed perhaps a bit distracted, he told investigators, but she was meticulous about the arrangements as always. She even reminded me about the upcoming Harvest Festival and confirmed she'd bring her famous apple pie. The most intriguing lead came from the bank. Susan Morrison's account of Florence's unusual visit on October 14th prompted investigators to request access to her financial records. The $8,000 withdrawal was significant, nearly a third of her savings, but it was the safety deposit box visit that captured their attention. Bank records showed Florence had rented the box in 1963, just 2 years after moving to Maple Street, and had accessed it only sporadically over the decades. When investigators obtained a warrant to examine the box's contents, they found it nearly empty. Only a few items remained: Robert's military discharge papers, the deed to the house, and a small velvet jewelry box containing what appeared to be a man's wedding ring. Not Robert's, which Margaret confirmed was buried with her father. The ring was inscribed with the initials JM and a date, June 15, 1963. The date was significant. Margaret confirmed that her parents had moved to Maple Street in August 1963, just 2 months after the date on the ring. When investigators asked about the initials JM, Margaret drew a blank. "I don't remember my mother ever mentioning anyone with those initials," she said. And she certainly never mentioned anything important happening in June of 1963. "That was before I was born. I came along in 1965. As the first week of the investigation concluded, police had more questions than answers. Florence Whitman had vanished deliberately, taking cash and personal items, but leaving behind a life that showed no obvious signs of distress or danger. The mysterious ring and the burned papers suggested secrets from her past, but without more concrete evidence, investigators could only file the case as a voluntary missing person and hope that Florence would eventually make contact. Margaret returned to Colorado after 2 weeks, leaving her mother's house exactly as she'd found it, hoping against hope that Florence would simply walk through the front door one day with a reasonable explanation for her disappearance. But as days turned to weeks and weeks to months, it became clear that Florence Whitman had vanished as completely as if she'd never existed at all. 6 months after Florence Whitman's disappearance, Detective Sarah Chen inherited the case from Sergeant Reeves, who had retired without making significant progress. Chen, a methodical investigator with 15 years of experience, approached the case with fresh eyes and a determination to uncover the truth behind Florence's vanishing. What she found was a trail that seemed to lead everywhere and nowhere at once. Chen's first step was to re-examine the physical evidence from Florence's house. The burned papers in the backyard had been reduced to ash, but forensic analysis revealed fragments of what appeared to be correspondence dating back decades. Among the charred remains, technicians found partial letterheads from various government agencies, including what looked like Social Security Administration documents and possibly immigration paperwork. Most intriguingly, they discovered fragments of photographs, not family snapshots but formal portraits of the type used for official documents. The detective also ordered a more thorough search of the house, focusing on areas that might have been overlooked during the initial investigation. In the basement, behind a water heater that hadn't been moved in years, Chen's team found a small metal box containing $3,000 in cash, all in bills dated before 1980. The money was wrapped in plastic and accompanied by a handwritten note in Florence's distinctive script: "Emergency fund. Use only if they find me." This discovery prompted Chen to dig deeper into Florence's background. What she found challenged everything the family and neighbors thought they knew about the quiet widow from Maple Street. According to Social Security records, Florence Whitman had first appeared in the system in August 1963, the same month she and Robert had moved to their house. Before that date, there was no record of Florence Whitman anywhere in the United States. Immigration records proved equally puzzling. While Robert Whitman's documentation was complete and traceable back to his birth in Ohio in 1932, Florence's paperwork showed inconsistencies that suggested either clerical errors or deliberate falsification. Her birth certificate, supposedly issued in Pennsylvania, contained a registration number that didn't match the state's numbering system for the claimed birth year of 1935. Chen contacted the Pennsylvania Bureau of Vital Records, which confirmed her suspicions. No birth certificate had ever been issued for a Florence Marie Whitman born on the date listed in her Social Security application. The certificate in Florence's possession was either a forgery or had been issued under false pretenses. This revelation transformed the missing person case into something far more complex. The detectives' investigation expanded to include federal agencies. The FBI's database search revealed no criminal record for Florence Whitman, but it did flag her name in connection with a 1963 inquiry into suspected immigration fraud. The case had been closed without charges, but the file contained a photograph that made Chen's blood run cold. The woman in the FBI photo looked exactly like Florence, but the name listed was Elena Kowalski, and she was wanted for questioning in connection with the disappearance of her husband, Jerzy Kowalski, in Chicago. According to the FBI file, Elena Kowalski had vanished from Chicago in June 1963, just days after her husband was found dead in their apartment under suspicious circumstances. The death had been ruled a suicide, but Elena's disappearance had raised questions that were never answered. The case had gone cold when investigators couldn't locate Elena, who seemed to have vanished without a trace. until she apparently resurfaced as Florence Whitman in a small town 300 miles away. Jen immediately contacted the Chicago Police Department's cold case unit, where Detective Michael Rossetti had been reviewing unsolved cases from the 1960s. The Kowalski file had crossed his desk several times over the years, and he was eager to share what he knew. Jerzy Kowalski was found hanging in his bedroom, Rossetti explained during a phone call. But there were inconsistencies. No suicide note, no history of depression, and neighbors reported hearing arguing the night before. Elena was our prime suspect, but she disappeared before we could question her. The Chicago investigation had revealed that Elena Kowalski was herself a mystery. She had married Jerzy in 1962, but her background before that was murky. Immigration records suggested she had entered the United States from Poland in 1961, but Polish authorities had no record of an Elena Kowalski matching her description. The woman who became Florence Whitman appeared to have been living under false identities for her entire adult life. Chen's team worked with federal investigators to piece together the timeline. Elena Kowalski had disappeared from Chicago on June 15, 1963, the same date inscribed on the wedding ring found in Florence's safety deposit box. The initials JM likely stood for Jerzy Kowalski, whose name would have been anglicized to Jerry in American records. The ring was apparently Elena's only memento of her dead husband, hidden away for 45 years. The investigation revealed that Elena had assumed the identity of Florence Whitman with remarkable thoroughness. She had obtained genuine documents through a sophisticated network that helped European immigrants establish new lives in America, often for people fleeing troubled pasts. The network had been dismantled by federal authorities in the late 1960s, but not before helping hundreds of people disappear into new identities. Robert Whitman's role in this deception remained unclear. Marriage records showed that he and Florence had wed in a small ceremony in Indiana in August 1963, just weeks after Elena Kowalski's disappearance. Whether Robert knew his wife's true identity was a question that died with him in 1995. Margaret, when informed of these discoveries, was devastated. "My entire life has been built on a lie," she told Chen. "I don't even know who my mother really was." The investigation had transformed Florence Whitman from a missing elderly woman into Elena Kowalski, a suspected murderer who had successfully hidden her identity for 45 years. But it still didn't answer the crucial question: where was she now? Chen suspected that something had triggered Elena's decision to abandon her carefully constructed life as Florence Whitman. The mysterious letters, the burned documents, and the sudden departure all suggested that her past had finally caught up with her. As the first anniversary of Florence's disappearance approached, Chen was no closer to finding her than Sergeant Reeves had been. The case had revealed a fascinating story of identity theft and possible murder, but Elena Kowalski had vanished as completely as Florence Whitman. The trail had gone cold, and Chen began to suspect that it would remain that way forever. By 2015, 7 years after Florence Whitman's disappearance, the case had become a footnote in Millbrook's local history. Detective Chen had been promoted and transferred to the state police, taking with her the institutional memory of the investigation. The house on Maple Street had been sold to a young family who knew nothing of its previous owner's mysterious past, and most of the neighbors who remembered Florence had either moved away or passed on. Margaret Whitman had struggled to rebuild her life after learning the truth about her mother's identity. The revelation that she was the daughter of a suspected murderer had shattered her sense of self and strained her relationship with her own daughter, Emma. Family gatherings became tense affairs, with unspoken questions hanging in the air like smoke from Florence's final bonfire. Margaret had undergone therapy to process the trauma of discovering that her entire childhood had been built on a foundation of lies. Emma Whitman, now 25 and working as a freelance journalist in Denver, had initially been fascinated by her grandmother's story. She'd spent months researching Elena Kowalski's background, traveling to Chicago to interview retired police officers, and digging through newspaper archives for any mention of the case. But the trail had grown cold decades before Emma was born, and her investigation had yielded little more than what Detective Chen had already discovered. The house itself had been transformed by its new owners, the Morrison family. They'd renovated the kitchen, updated the bathrooms, and converted Florence's basement storage area into a playroom for their 2 young children. The garden where Florence had burned her secrets was now a swing set and sandbox, and the neighbors who had once watched her every move were replaced by busy professionals who barely knew each other's names. Mrs. Henderson, now 87 and living in an assisted care facility, was one of the few people who still talked about Florence's disappearance. She would tell anyone who would listen about that October evening when she watched her neighbor walk away into the darkness. "She knew something the rest of us didn't," Mrs. Henderson would say, her voice still sharp despite her age. "That woman was carrying secrets that would have killed a lesser person." The Millbrook Police Department had officially closed the case in 2013, 5 years after Florence's disappearance. Without new evidence or credible sightings, there was nothing more they could do. The file was archived in the basement of the municipal building, gathering dust alongside hundreds of other unsolved cases. Occasionally, a new detective would review the file out of curiosity, but the trail had gone so cold that even the most dedicated investigator couldn't find a new angle to pursue. Margaret had inherited her mother's house and its contents, but she'd found the experience of going through Florence's belongings too painful to complete. Many of Florence's personal items remained exactly where she'd left them. Her reading glasses on the kitchen table, her favorite coffee mug in the cabinet, her collection of mystery novels arranged alphabetically on the living room shelves. Margaret had boxed up the most personal items and stored them in her own basement in Colorado, unable to throw them away, but equally unable to look at them. Emma had tried several times to convince her mother to let her finish going through Florence's belongings. As a journalist, she was trained to look for details that others might miss, and she believed there might be clues that the police had overlooked. But Margaret was adamant that the past should remain buried. "Some secrets are meant to stay hidden," she would tell Emma. "Your grandmother, or whoever she was, made her choice. We need to respect that and move on with our lives." The mystery had taken its toll on the entire family. Margaret's marriage had ended in divorce in 2012, partly due to the stress of the revelations about her mother. She'd thrown herself into her work at the insurance company, using the demands of her job to avoid thinking about the questions that would never be answered. She'd stopped taking Emma's calls about the case and had made it clear that she considered the subject closed. Emma, however, couldn't let go. The journalist in her was fascinated by the story of a woman who had successfully hidden her identity for 45 years, only to vanish when her past finally caught up with her. She'd written several articles about missing persons cases, always hoping that one of them might generate a lead about her grandmother. She'd also maintained contact with Detective Chen, who had retired from the state police but still occasionally thought about the case that had consumed so much of her career. In 2014, Emma had received a call from a private investigator in Chicago who claimed to have new information about Elena Kowalski. The man, who identified himself as Thomas Brennan, said he'd been hired by Jerzy Kowalski's family to investigate his death and had uncovered evidence that Elena might still be alive. But when Emma tried to follow up, she discovered that no private investigator named Thomas Brennan was licensed in Illinois, and the phone number he'd given her was disconnected. The incident had spooked Emma and convinced Margaret that her daughter's obsession with the case was becoming dangerous. "There are people out there who don't want this story told," Margaret warned. "If your grandmother was running from something, maybe we should be running too." But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the mysterious phone call was connected to her grandmother's disappearance, and that someone, somewhere, knew more than they were saying. As 2015 drew to a close, the case of Florence Whitman seemed destined to remain unsolved. The woman who had lived quietly on Maple Street for 47 years had taken her secrets with her, leaving behind only questions and a family struggling to understand who she really was. The trail had gone cold, the witnesses were aging or dead, and the physical evidence had yielded all the clues it was going to provide. But in a basement in Colorado, among boxes of Florence's belongings that Margaret couldn't bear to examine, a letter waited patiently to be discovered. A letter that would change everything and finally reveal the truth about what happened on that October evening in 2008, when an elderly woman walked away from her life and into the darkness, carrying with her the weight of secrets that had shaped 5 decades of carefully constructed lies. In March 2023, 15 years after Florence Whitman's disappearance, Emma Whitman found herself standing in her mother's basement in Colorado Springs, surrounded by boxes that had remained untouched for over a decade. Margaret had suffered a mild heart attack the previous month, and during her recovery, she'd finally agreed to let Emma sort through Florence's belongings. "I can't take those secrets to my grave too," Margaret had said from her hospital bed, her voice weak but resolute. "Maybe it's time you found whatever answers are in those boxes." Emma, now 33, and an established investigative journalist, approached the task with the methodical precision that had made her career. She'd covered missing persons cases, cold case murders, and government conspiracies, but nothing had prepared her for the emotional weight of sorting through her grandmother's hidden life. Each box contained layers of carefully preserved memories, as if Florence had been curating her own museum of secrets. The first few boxes contained the expected items: photograph albums with pictures of Margaret's childhood, Robert's military medals, and decades of Christmas cards from distant relatives. But as Emma dug deeper, she began to find items that didn't fit the narrative of Florence Whitman's quiet suburban life. There were letters written in what appeared to be Polish, newspaper clippings about unsolved murders in Chicago, and a collection of false identification documents bearing different names, but all featuring Florence's photograph. The most disturbing discovery was a manila envelope labeled "Insurance Policies" that contained no insurance documents at all. Instead, Emma found detailed dossiers on 3 different women, complete with photographs, addresses, and personal information. The women appeared to be roughly Florence's age, and all had died in the early 1960s under circumstances that would have made identity theft relatively easy. Florence hadn't just assumed one false identity. She'd had backup plans ready in case Elena Kowalski's cover was blown. But it was in the 7th box, hidden beneath layers of winter clothing that still smelled faintly of Florence's lavender perfume, that Emma made the discovery that would change everything. Wrapped in a silk scarf and tucked inside an old jewelry box was a letter, addressed to "My dearest granddaughter," in Florence's distinctive handwriting. The envelope was sealed with red wax, and the paper was the same cream-colored stationery with embossed roses that Florence had used for special occasions. Emma's hands trembled as she broke the wax seal. The letter was dated October 14, 2008, the day Florence disappeared, and it began with words that made Emma's heart race. "If you are reading this, then I am either dead or have finally found the courage to disappear forever. There are things you need to know about who I really was and why I had to leave." The letter was 12 pages long, written in Florence's careful script, and it told a story that was both more complex and more tragic than anything the police investigation had uncovered. Elena Kowalski, the woman who became Florence Whitman, had not murdered her husband, Jerzy. She had been running from him, and from a network of people who had been hunting her since she'd witnessed something she was never supposed to see. According to the letter, Elena had been born Elena Nowak in a displaced persons camp in Germany in 1945, the daughter of Polish refugees who had fled their homeland during World War II. Her parents had died when she was 16, leaving her alone and vulnerable in a world that had little use for stateless refugees. She'd been recruited by a man who promised her passage to America and a new life, but the reality had been far different from what she'd been promised. "I was brought to America to be a bride," Florence had written, "but not the kind of bride a young woman dreams of becoming. I was sold to men who collected women like other people collect stamps. Jerzy was supposed to be my husband, but he was really my keeper, and when I tried to leave, he made it clear that I would never be free." The letter revealed that Elena had discovered Jerzy was part of a human trafficking network that brought young European women to America under false pretenses. The women were forced into marriages with men who used them as domestic servants, or worse. Elena had tried to escape several times, but Jerzy had always found her and brought her back. The arguing that neighbors had heard the night before Jerzy's death hadn't been a domestic dispute. It had been Elena's final attempt to negotiate her freedom. "I didn't kill him," Florence had written, "but I didn't try to save him either. He came home drunk that night and started hitting me again, telling me I would never leave him alive. But he was drunker than usual, and when he tried to grab me, he fell and hit his head on the corner of the kitchen table. I watched him bleed to death on the floor, and I felt nothing but relief. Elena had staged the scene to look like a suicide, knowing that if the police investigated Jersey's death too closely, they would discover the trafficking network, and she would become a target for the other men involved. She'd taken the money Jersey kept hidden in their apartment, money that belonged to the network, and used it to buy a new identity and start over as Florence Whitman. Robert saved me, the letter continued. He was a good man who asked no questions when I told him I was running from an abusive husband. He married me knowing I couldn't tell him my real name, and he protected me for 32 years without ever asking for the truth. When he died, I thought my secrets would die with him. But the past has a way of catching up with you. The letter explained that Florence had been receiving threatening letters for months before her disappearance. Someone had discovered her true identity and was demanding money to keep quiet. The letters had started small, requests for a few $100s, but had escalated to demands for thousands. The final letter, received 3 days before she disappeared, had contained a photograph of Margaret and Emma, along with a message that made it clear her family was now in danger. "They found me after all these years," Florence had written, "and they want the money I took from Jersey, plus interest. But it's not about the money anymore. It's about what I know. The network never stopped operating, and there are powerful people who can't afford to have their involvement exposed. I have to disappear again to protect you and your mother." The letter contained detailed instructions for Emma to follow if she ever found it. Hidden in the basement of the Maple Street house behind a loose brick in the foundation wall was a metal box containing documents that would expose the trafficking network and the prominent men who had been involved. Florence had spent 45 years collecting evidence, knowing that someday she might need it to protect herself or her family. "I'm not a good person," the letter concluded, "but I tried to be a good mother and grandmother. I hope you can forgive me for the lies, and I hope you'll use what I've left behind to make sure no other young women suffer the way I did. The truth is more important than my reputation, and justice is more important than my peace." Emma sat in the basement for hours, reading and rereading the letter as the full scope of her grandmother's deception became clear. Florence Whitman hadn't been a murderer. She'd been a victim who had found the strength to escape and build a new life. But her past had finally caught up with her, and she'd made the ultimate sacrifice to protect her family. The letter changed everything Emma thought she knew about her grandmother's disappearance. Florence hadn't vanished because she was running from the law. She disappeared because she was still running from the same people who had enslaved her 60 years earlier. And if the letter was telling the truth, those people were still out there, still operating and still dangerous. Emma knew she had to return to the house on Maple Street and find the evidence Florence had hidden. But she also knew that doing so would put her in the same danger that had forced her grandmother to disappear. The question was whether she had the courage to finish what Florence had started, and whether the truth was worth the risk of following in her grandmother's footsteps into the darkness. Emma Whitman arrived in Millbrook on a gray April morning in 2023, driving the same route her grandmother had walked 15 years earlier when she disappeared into the night. The town had changed little since Florence's time. The same tree-lined streets, the same modest houses, the same sense of quiet suburban normalcy that had provided perfect cover for a woman living under a false identity. The house on Maple Street was now painted yellow instead of white, and the garden where Florence had burned her secrets was dominated by a large oak tree that the Morrison family had planted to provide shade for their children's play area. Emma parked across the street and studied the house for several minutes, trying to imagine her grandmother's final hours within those walls, writing the letter that would finally reveal the truth about her life. Emma had spent the past month preparing for this moment. She'd researched the current owners of the house, the Morrison family, and had crafted a story about being a journalist writing an article about the neighborhood's history. She'd also contacted Detective Chen, now retired but still sharp at 68, who had agreed to meet her in Millbrook to discuss the case that had haunted her for years. "I always knew there was more to Florence's story," Chen told Emma over coffee at Miller's Corner Store, the same place Florence had bought her daily bread for decades. The evidence never quite fit together, and there were too many loose ends. But without new leads, there was nothing more we could do. When Emma showed her Florence's letter, Chen's eyes widened with a mixture of vindication and concern. "This changes everything," Chen said, studying the handwritten pages. If Florence was telling the truth about the trafficking network, then her disappearance wasn't just about escaping her past. It was about protecting evidence that could bring down some very powerful people. That makes her both a victim and a potential witness to ongoing crimes. Chen agreed to help Emma search for the hidden evidence, using her retired status and knowledge of the case to provide legitimacy for their investigation. They approached the Morrison family together, explaining that they were following up on some loose ends from the previous owner's disappearance. The Morrisons, a young couple with 2 elementary school children, were initially hesitant, but became more cooperative when Chen showed them her retired detective credentials. "We've always wondered about the woman who lived here before us," said Janet Morrison, the wife. "The neighbors told us she just vanished one day, and there were rumors about her having secrets. We found some old papers in the basement when we renovated, but we threw them away thinking they were just junk mail." The basement had been completely transformed since Florence's time. The concrete walls were now painted bright white, and the space had been converted into a playroom with colorful foam mats and toy storage bins. But the foundation walls were original, and Emma began systematically examining them for loose bricks, while Chen kept the Morrison children entertained upstairs. It took nearly 3 hours of careful searching before Emma found what she was looking for. Behind the water heater, in a section of wall that would have been hidden by Florence's storage boxes, one brick was slightly different from the others. When Emma pressed on it, it shifted inward, revealing a cavity that had been carefully carved out of the foundation. Inside the cavity was a metal document box, wrapped in plastic and sealed with tape that had somehow survived 15 years in the damp basement. Emma's hands shook as she opened the box, revealing a treasure trove of evidence that Florence had been collecting for decades. There were photographs, documents, newspaper clippings, and what appeared to be a detailed ledger recording names, dates, and financial transactions. The photographs were the most damning evidence. They showed prominent men from Chicago's business and political elite at parties and gatherings with young women who looked frightened and out of place. Some of the men were recognizable even to Emma: a federal judge who had served on the bench for 30 years, a businessman who had run for mayor in the 1980s, and several others whose names appeared regularly in Chicago society pages. The ledger was even more revealing. It contained detailed records of the trafficking operation, including the names of women who had been brought to America, the men who had purchased them, and the amounts of money that had changed hands. Florence had apparently been keeping these records as insurance, documenting every aspect of the network's operations in case she ever needed to expose them. Among the documents was a letter addressed to Elena Kowalski, dated just 1 week before Florence's disappearance. The letter was signed by someone identified only as the Collector, and it made clear that Florence's past had indeed caught up with her. "We know where you are, Elena," the letter read. "We know about your daughter and granddaughter. You have something that belongs to us and we want it back. You have 1 week to contact us or we will come for your family." The letter included a phone number and instructions for arranging a meeting. Emma realized that this was the final threat that had prompted Florence to disappear, not just to protect herself, but to draw the danger away from Margaret and Emma. Florence had sacrificed her carefully constructed life to keep her family safe from the people who had enslaved her 60 years earlier. Chen examined the evidence with the eye of an experienced investigator. "This is enough to reopen multiple cold cases," she said. "Some of these men are still alive, and if we can verify the authenticity of these documents, we could finally bring them to justice. But Emma, you need to understand what you're getting into. These people killed to protect their secrets 60 years ago, and they'll kill to protect them now." Emma knew Chen was right, but she also knew she couldn't walk away from the truth her grandmother had died to preserve. Florence had spent 45 years collecting this evidence, waiting for the right moment to expose the network that had destroyed so many lives. That moment had finally come, but it would require Emma to risk everything her grandmother had tried to protect. As they carefully packed the evidence back into the metal box, Emma made a decision that would change her life forever. She would use her skills as an investigative journalist to tell Florence's story and expose the trafficking network, no matter the personal cost. It was what her grandmother would have wanted, and it was the only way to ensure that Florence's sacrifice hadn't been in vain. But first, Emma needed to find out what had happened to Florence after she disappeared. The letter had explained why she'd left, but it hadn't revealed where she'd gone or whether she was still alive. Emma suspected that the answer to that question was hidden somewhere in the evidence Florence had left behind, waiting for someone with the courage to look for it. 3 months after discovering Florence's hidden evidence, Emma Whitman sat in a secure conference room at the FBI's Chicago field office, surrounded by agents, prosecutors, and boxes of documents that would ultimately lead to the largest human trafficking prosecution in the city's history. The evidence Florence had collected over 45 years had proven to be a roadmap to a criminal network that had operated with impunity for decades, protected by wealth, influence, and the silence of its victims. Special Agent Maria Santos, who headed the FBI's Human Trafficking Task Force, had been skeptical when Emma first approached the Bureau with her grandmother's story. But the evidence was undeniable, and it corroborated intelligence the FBI had been gathering about suspected trafficking operations dating back to the 1960s. Your grandmother was essentially working as an undercover investigator for half a century, Santos told Emma. She documented crimes that we never even knew had been committed. The investigation had moved quickly once federal authorities became involved. Several of the men identified in Florence's photographs and ledger were still alive, and when confronted with the evidence, 2 of them had agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences. Their testimony had led to the discovery of additional evidence, including financial records that showed the trafficking network had evolved over the decades, but had never stopped operating. But the most shocking revelation came when agents raided the Chicago home of Vincent Castellano, a 92-year-old former city councilman who had been identified in Florence's records as the Collector. In Castellano's basement, investigators found a room that served as a shrine to his criminal enterprise. Walls covered with photographs of the women he had trafficked, detailed records of their fates, and trophies taken from those who had tried to escape. Among the photographs was one that made Emma's blood run cold. It showed Florence as a young woman, probably taken shortly after she'd arrived in America, standing next to Jerzy Kowalski and 2 other men Emma didn't recognize. On the back of the photograph, someone had written, "Elena, property of J. Kowalski, 1962-1963. The casual dehumanization of the notation revealed the mindset of men who viewed women as commodities to be bought, sold, and disposed of when they were no longer useful. But it was another discovery in Castellano's house that finally answered the question that had haunted Emma for months. What had happened to Florence after she disappeared? Hidden in a filing cabinet was a folder labeled Loose Ends, and inside was a collection of documents related to Florence's final days. The folder contained surveillance photographs of Florence's house on Maple Street, copies of the threatening letters she'd received, and a detailed plan for her elimination. According to the documents, Castellano had hired a private investigator to track down Elena Kowalski in 2008, after one of his associates had recognized her in a newspaper photograph taken at a church fundraiser. The investigator had confirmed her identity and location, and Castellano had begun a campaign of psychological warfare designed to force her to return the money she'd taken from Jerzy's apartment and to eliminate her as a potential witness. The final document in the folder was a report dated October 16, 2008, 2 days after Florence's disappearance. It was written by someone identified only as the Cleaner, and it detailed how Florence had been intercepted as she tried to leave Millbrook. According to the report, she had been taken to an abandoned warehouse outside the city, where she had been interrogated about the evidence she'd collected over the years. Subject refused to cooperate despite enhanced persuasion. The report stated in clinical language that barely concealed its brutality. Subject claimed evidence was hidden, but would not reveal location. Disposal completed per standard protocol. Body transported to secondary location for final processing. Emma felt sick as she read the cold, bureaucratic language that described her grandmother's final hours. Florence had died protecting the evidence that would eventually bring down her killers, enduring torture rather than reveal the location of the documents that could save other women from the same fate she had suffered. But the report contained one final detail that gave Emma a measure of peace. In her last moments, Florence had told her captors that she had hidden a letter for her granddaughter, a letter that would expose everything if anything happened to her. Subject expressed confidence that Granddaughter would find evidence and continue investigation, the report noted. Subject died believing justice would eventually be served. The warehouse mentioned in the report had been demolished years earlier, but FBI agents had located the secondary location where Florence's body had been disposed of. It was a remote area in Indiana, where Castellano's organization had buried dozens of victims over the decades. Ground-penetrating radar had identified multiple burial sites, and forensic teams were working to identify the remains and return them to their families. Emma was present when agents found what they believed to be Florence's grave. The remains were too degraded for visual identification, but DNA testing would eventually confirm what Emma already knew in her heart. Her grandmother had been murdered for trying to expose the truth, but her death had not been in vain. The evidence she'd hidden had survived, and it would finally bring justice for her and the countless other women who had suffered at the hands of Castellano's network. Vincent Castellano died in federal custody 3 weeks after his arrest, taking many of his secrets to the grave. But the evidence Florence had collected led to the indictment of 12 other men, including several who were still actively involved in trafficking operations. The case made national headlines, and Emma's articles about her grandmother's story won a Pulitzer Prize for investigative journalism. At Florence's memorial service, held at St. Mary's Episcopal Church in Millbrook, Emma read from the letter her grandmother had left for her. "I hope you can forgive me for the lies," Emma read, her voice breaking with emotion. "And I hope you'll use what I've left behind to make sure no other young women suffer the way I did." The church was packed with people whose lives Florence had touched during her 47 years on Maple Street, as well as representatives from organizations that fought human trafficking. Emma realized that her grandmother's greatest achievement hadn't been successfully hiding her identity for decades. It had been building a life of kindness and service despite the trauma she'd endured. As the service concluded, Emma made a promise to continue her grandmother's work. She would use her platform as a journalist to tell the stories of trafficking victims, to expose the networks that exploited vulnerable women, and to ensure that Florence Whitman's sacrifice would inspire others to fight for justice. The mystery of Florence's disappearance had finally been solved, but her legacy would live on in the lives she'd saved and the criminals she'd helped bring to justice. She had been a victim, a survivor, and ultimately a hero, and Emma was proud to be her granddaughter. 2 years after Vincent Castellano's death and the exposure of the trafficking network, Emma Whitman stood in the garden behind the house on Maple Street, watching as the Morrison children played on the swing set that now occupied the spot where Florence had burned her secrets 15 years earlier. The irony wasn't lost on her. Where her grandmother had once destroyed evidence to protect her false identity, children now played in the sunshine, innocent of the darkness that had once consumed this place. The Morrison family had invited Emma to visit whenever she was in town, and she'd become something of an honorary aunt to their children. They knew her as the granddaughter of the mysterious woman who had lived in their house before them, but they were too young to understand the full scope of Florence's story. Emma preferred it that way. Children should be allowed to play without the weight of such knowledge. The federal prosecution of the trafficking network had concluded 6 months earlier with the conviction of 8 men on charges ranging from human trafficking to murder. 4 others had died during the investigation, taking their secrets with them, but the evidence Florence had collected had been enough to dismantle an operation that had destroyed hundreds of lives over 6 decades. The case had become a landmark in the fight against human trafficking, and Florence's story had inspired new legislation to protect victims and prosecute traffickers. Emma's book about her grandmother's life, titled The Woman Who Disappeared Twice, had become a bestseller and had been optioned for a television miniseries. The book told the complete story of Elena Kowalski's transformation into Florence Whitman, her 45 years of careful documentation, and her ultimate sacrifice to protect her family and expose the truth. Emma had donated all proceeds from the book to organizations that fought human trafficking, feeling that profiting from her grandmother's suffering would be a betrayal of her memory. Margaret Whitman had struggled with the revelations about her mother's true identity, But she'd eventually found peace in understanding that Florence's lies had been motivated by love and necessity rather than malice. She'd attended every day of the federal trial, sitting in the front row as prosecutors detailed the horrors her mother had endured and the courage she'd shown in documenting them. "I finally understand why she was always so protective," Margaret had told Emma. "She was trying to shield us from a world we couldn't imagine." The house on Maple Street had become an unofficial pilgrimage site for survivors of human trafficking and their advocates. Emma had worked with the Morrison family to install a small memorial plaque in the front garden, identifying the house as the former home of Florence Whitman, who lived with courage and died for truth. The plaque didn't mention Elena Kowalski or the details of Florence's past. Some stories were too complex for bronze markers. Detective Chen, now 70 and fully retired, had become a close friend and collaborator in Emma's ongoing investigation of cold cases related to human trafficking. The evidence Florence had collected had provided leads in dozens of other cases, and Chen had volunteered her time to help law enforcement agencies across the country connect the dots between seemingly unrelated disappearances and murders from decades past. "Your grandmother was the most successful undercover investigator I've ever encountered," Chen had told Emma during their last meeting. "She spent 45 years building a case that no law enforcement agency could have developed on its own. She was patient, methodical, and absolutely fearless when it mattered most." Emma had also maintained contact with some of the other survivors who had been identified through Florence's records. Many were elderly now, and some had died before they could see justice served. But those who remained had found comfort in knowing that their suffering had not been forgotten. They'd formed an informal support network, meeting annually on the anniversary of Florence's disappearance, to honor her memory and support each other's continued healing. The FBI had established a task force dedicated to investigating historical human trafficking cases, using Florence's evidence as a template for understanding how such networks operated and evolved over time. Agent Santos had been promoted to head the task force, and she'd credited Florence's documentation with revolutionizing their approach to these investigations. "She showed us that victims can be their own best advocates," Santos had said. "Sometimes the people we're trying to save are already saving themselves. We just need to listen to them." Emma's own life had been transformed by her grandmother's story. She'd left her job at the Denver newspaper to become a freelance investigative journalist, specializing in human trafficking cases. Her work had taken her around the world, from the brothels of Southeast Asia to the agricultural fields of California, documenting the modern forms of slavery that continued to exploit vulnerable people. In every story she told, she carried with her the lessons Florence had taught her about courage, persistence, and the power of truth. The mystery of Florence Whitman's disappearance had been solved, but her story continued to inspire new investigations and new efforts to combat human trafficking. Emma had received letters from law enforcement officers, social workers, and survivors who had been motivated by Florence's example to speak out about their own experiences, or to pursue justice in cases that had seemed hopeless. As Emma prepared to leave Millbrook after her latest visit, she stopped at Riverside Cemetery to visit Robert Whitman's grave. Florence's remains had finally been laid to rest beside her husband's, and Emma had arranged for a new headstone that honored both of her grandmother's identities. Elena Kowalski Whitman, 1935-2008, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother. She lived with courage and died for truth. Standing in the quiet cemetery, Emma reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She'd started with questions about a missing grandmother and had discovered a story of survival, sacrifice, and ultimate redemption. Florence had spent her life running from the truth, but in the end, she'd ensured that the truth would survive her. The sun was setting as Emma walked back to her car, casting long shadows across the cemetery grounds. She thought about the letter Florence had left for her, the words that had started this entire journey. "The truth is more important than my reputation, and justice is more important than my peace." Florence Whitman had found her peace at last, and her truth had set countless others free. Her disappearance had been the final act of a life lived in service to justice, and her legacy would continue to protect vulnerable women for generations to come. The woman who had disappeared twice had finally come home, and her story would never be forgotten.